I call this meeting of the Northeast Independent School District to order. Let the record show that a quorum of board members is present, that this meeting has been duly called, and that notice of this meeting has been posted in accordance with the Texas Open Meetings Act, Texas Government Code, Chapter 551. The time is 5:31 p.m. This board will now adjourn into executive session pursuant to the following sections of the Texas Open Meetings Act, Texas Government Code, Section 551.074, to discuss personnel or to hear complaints against personnel, and the time is 5:31. board will now convene in open session, and the time is 5:49 p.m. Item 4, matters from executive session. A, personnel, including but not limited to administrative appointments pursuant to Government Code Section 551.074. 1, possible action regarding routine personnel, including but not limited to administrative appointments. A, principal of Churchill High School. Do I have a motion to approve as discussed in executive session?
So moved.
Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Ms. Villarreal.
Yes.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. Motion passes 6-0. Item 5, new business for possible board action. A, business services. 1, possible action regarding notice of public meeting to discuss budget and proposed tax rate. Mr. Villarreal.
Yes, Mr. President, members of the board, Dr. Mike, executive staff and guests. We bring to you the notice that we want to publish for our adoption on June 19th. If there's any questions, we can answer.
That was, I think, provided to you all in the packet on the action item. Are there any questions for Mr. Villarreal? All right, seeing none, do I have a motion to approve the publication of the notice of public meeting to discuss budget and proposed tax rates in accordance with Texas Education Code Section 44.004, setting the public meeting date as June 19th, 2025.
So moved.
Thank you, Ms. Landry. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Ms. Villarreal. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. Motion passes 6-0. Item 6, presentation. A, budget study session number 1. Mr. Villarreal.
Yes, Mr. President, I turn it over to Susie Lackhorn, our Executive Director of Finance and Accounting, to present our first budget study session.
I should have just thrown it to you. I knew that, but follow the script.
All right, good evening. Let's take a look at tonight's agenda. We're going to look at the schedule, our adoption rules, and we're really just going to spend tonight focused in on revenue, do a little bit of benchmarking related to that revenue, and then do a legislative update on finance bills that may impact us. For the schedule, our first meeting's tonight. Just talked about what we're going to cover. The second meeting is a little bit deeper. We're going to talk about staffing and additional allocation requests, changes for next year basically, health insurance, compensation. We'll also start talking about school nutrition and debt service then. Then Monday on June 16th, we'll have a regular board meeting in between that June 2nd and June 16th. So if we have any updates or anything else we need to discuss, we'll have that available. And then Monday, June 16th, we'll do our final updates, additional compensation if needed at that point in time. Remember, we have a legislative session going on, as if anybody can forget. And things can change very rapidly between June 2nd and the 16th, depending on any number of factors. We'll do a detailed budget view and then adopt on Thursday, June 19th. So our adoption rules, we have to adopt a budget by the 30th. You have to adopt budgets for the general fund, debt service, and school nutrition services fund. We have to do it in a public meeting, and we must publish a notice about that public meeting on our website and in a newspaper at least 10 days, but no more than 30 days before the meeting. And so the item that you just approved was you authorizing us to put that notice in the paper. We do not adopt the tax rate at the time we adopt the budget. We have to wait until after the Texas Education Agency provides us with our maximum compressed tax rate. And they do that after we get certified property values from our appraisal district. So we'll be doing that in August or September, depending on when we get those notices. So let's dive in. Let's look at revenue. As you have heard before, the bulk of our revenue comes from property taxes. We're looking at focused on the general fund tonight. We get the next largest piece, 63% from property taxes. The next largest piece at 26.7% is from the state providing aid based off of the funding formula. They also provide another 5.6% as a on behalf for the teacher retirement system. We get a little bit of federal aid in the general fund and other local, such as charges for football tickets, investing our cash and earning interest, renting out our facilities. That falls into other local. So how is that funding formula driven? Well, as you've heard us say many, many times before, our revenue formulas are based on average daily attendance. Every student who, if they were to attend every single day, is allocated a base amount of $6,160. And then the state recognizes that some students require additional services, and so the funding formula will provide weights and additional funding for students in specialized services and settings, such as special education, career and tech, bilingual, dyslexia. And once you combine all those allotments, it forms Tier 1 of the funding model. And then in addition, the state has Tier 2, which is the golden pennies. And I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth about both of these here in a minute. But Tier 1, these are the factors that roll into Tier 1. The state looks at your average daily attendance, which is just a factor of your enrollment and attendance rate, those instructional settings to figure out what additional funds are needed for those students, and then they also look at your property values and your property taxes. So for Tier 1, these are the big allotments that are a part of Tier 1. The regular program allotment, that is your basic allotment, is what we call it on a regular basis. The weight is your average daily attendance times 6160, and you can see here what we had for the end of last year, are projected for the current year, and a preliminary projection for 25-26. And as you can see, that number is shrinking year to year. When we would talk about enrollment in a few minutes, you'll see as we lose students, this allotment will go down. Special education is the next biggest allotment, and it's got a massive formula. It looks at individual settings within the special education program, and we are projecting a growth from last year as we had some students change from one setting to another, and then projecting it to stay pretty constant for the next year. Our dyslexia allotment is a 0.1 weight, and so all of these allotments, not all of them, but most of them are a function of that 6160. And so this is the 6160 times 0.1 times the average daily attendance of students with dyslexia. And you can see that allotment stays pretty steady. Compensatory education, this is for our students who are at risk. It varies by tier. Bilingual education has different weights depending on which setting those students are in. Career and technology, same thing there. Depending on what level class, there's, is it the intro class or an upper division class, will have different weights. Early education is meant to help fund achievement for third grade reading and math, and so these are funds that are spent helping achieve passage of STAR at that grade level. Gifted and talented is another weight, and there's a cap of your 5% of your enrollment there. College, career, military readiness, it depends on the number of grads, and then there's a flat dollar amount per the grads that meet that indicator. And then we have school safety, which is $10 times your average daily attendance, and $15,000 per campus. You've heard us talk about this one quite a bit whenever we were covering some of our safety requirements in the past. Transportation is a flat rate per mile, and then there's some other little ones that make up the bulk of it, but this is how you get your total of Tier 1. And once you get your total for Tier 1, then you've calculated your total entitlement, right? So that was what we just did. We went through each allotment, calculated the entitlement. Then the state's going to say, okay, how much do you collect in property taxes of that total entitlement? And then whatever is remaining for us, they'll fill in the gap with their funding. Now, for the districts who collect more in property taxes than their entitlement, that money overflows the cup, as we have talked in the past, and they have to send that back to the state through recapture. That's the basic premise of how Tier 1 works. Tier 2 actually has a pretty similar concept, but it's a little bit harder to put your hands around. It's looking at weighted average daily attendance, and it has a guaranteed yield, and it matters how many pennies you have adopted above your base, your MCR, your maximum compressed tax rate. And so let's take a look at that. So for the first 8 cents that a district taxes above the base rate, the state will enrich that. And basically what the state is saying here is, we're going to make sure you collect as much for these golden pennies as the 96th wealthiest district in the state. So most districts don't collect that much in taxes as the 96th property wealthy district in the state does. So to get there, the state's going to make up the difference. They're going to take your weighted average ADA times the yield rate from that 96th wealthiest district. Right now, that yield rate is set at $129. So $129 times your weighted ADA times the number of pennies. So then they say, how much did you collect in taxes for those pennies? And they give us the difference. So it's just like the cup, but with a slightly different formula. And they're making sure that you collect as much on a penny as that 96th percentile wealthiest district. Okay? So this is a very key concept that is now being talked about in the legislature. So we're going to talk a little bit more about what they're looking at here. In total, a penny's above your base rate, you could go all the way up to 17, but only those first 8 are at this golden level where they're guaranteeing that yield rate of that 96th wealthiest district. We have 5 pennies, and you have to go to voter approval to go over the 5. The pennies between 8 and 17 aren't worth as much. They don't have quite the yield on this. And for a district like us, those pennies would trigger recapture. So once we have 2 pieces of the tax rate, we have the tax rate that's set by the TEA, your maximum compressed rate, and then you have however many pennies you've adopted as enrichment, your golden pennies plus your copper pennies, which are the ones between 8 and 17. So we have 5 golden. So right now our tax rate is 6507 plus 5 is 7007. Then that's your total maintenance and operations tax rate. And then your debt service, the one that helps you pay your debt, is for us 30 cents at this time, and our total tax rate is just a smidge over $1. Those golden pennies, those 5 in tier 2 for enrichment, they're worth about $9 million. And the state is helping make up the difference to get it all the way to $9 million, to get it to be the same value as that 96th percentile wealthiest district. All right, so now that we've talked about the rate, let's see how the property tax timeline works with all this. So between January and April, the appraisal district will appraise the properties. They'll process exemptions requests, and then in April and May, they're going to notify property owners of their preliminary appraisal value. Then property owners have until May 15th to protest, and then the appraisal review board starts hearing protests from property owners. We get our first look at the end of April for preliminary values. Then between August and September, school districts, cities, and counties will start to adopt their tax rates. And on October 1st, the tax assessor collector will send tax bills to property owners, and then payment is due to the tax assessor collector January 31st. So what do our 25, 26 property values, how are they calculated? So the amounts on the upcoming slide are rough estimates using the preliminary values that they gave us. But realize that they haven't even received all the protests yet when they give us preliminary values. So they're going to keep processing all those protests and then give us certified values at the end of the July. But we will be adopting our budget before we know what values the county is certifying. And even after the end of July, there'll be lawsuits, and some of the protests take a really long time to process. So we're, at this point in time, we're going to use the estimates using our most recent historical trends of how the appraisal roll changes from preliminary to certified. And just to give you an idea of what home prices are doing in Bexar County, the appraisal district sends us countywide home prices. Average sale price is the orange line, median sales price is the blue line. And as you can see, we were on a steady uptick, and then the last 2 years we've seen a slight decline in home sales prices. For 25-26, our preliminary values look like our home values as a whole are pretty flat. The market has definitely slowed as interest rates have risen over the last few years to fight inflation. And the few years leading up to that were record-setting. We broke quite a few records in appraisal value growth in those preceding years. Right now, before protest adjustments, single-family housing has risen by 0.3%. Existing homes declined 0.1%, and we had a little bit of new growth of 0.4%. Bear in mind, some homeowners, the trend for the whole area is not unique to individuals. So there will be homeowners who grew substantially within our district and within the county. It's just when you take the group as a whole, it stayed pretty flat. So not everybody will see this constant similar value. Some people will go up, some people will go down. It all just comes out to what the group averages out to be. Commercial property, that's always a little bit tougher. They tend to hire big law firms to help them fight their protests. And so we did see growth there, over 7%, but they tend to drop a bigger percentage during the protest process. And so we'll start getting updates from the appraisal district second week of June. And so we'll start seeing what it looks like as they process protests and how it impacts those preliminary values. But typically we see a bigger swing on commercial property. The good news is commercial property is not as big of a component as our overall home value is to the total property value. So the bigger piece is more consistent. So when we look at our estimated property tax revenue, our appraised value we're thinking is going to drop by 0.6 billion or 0.8%. Homestead caps and exemption. Now, a homestead cap is when your value growth was more than 10% from one year to the next, and that holds over to the next year. So when we were seeing massive growth in the couple of years prior to this, some homes were growing by more than 10%, and so that was sitting in a cap, and then it rolls in. So we're not going to see as big of a cap as we've seen in the past as that starts to get eaten up without this, since the growth isn't as high as it's been in the past. So then our total taxable value looks like it's going to even out if the trends hold. Our frozen values, as homeowners age into over 65, they can get their taxes frozen, and so each year that number tends to grow in our community as those homes are being held by homeowners and not turning over as much as they did in the past. And so that number is growing, and our net taxable value is decreasing by about 1.2% based off of the estimates. That would mean our tax rate would not get compressed because our values are not growing by more than 2.5%. So state law requires that if your property tax collections grow by more than 2.5%, the tax rate has to be compressed down to prevent you from collecting more. And then the state would come in and make up the difference for you based off of the CUP, the funding formula. But we're looking at no change there based off of the requirements of the law. We add back in our frozen taxes, and then we end up with M&O taxes just $1 million different based off of what the preliminary looks like at this point in time. All right, just a couple of key reminders, and I'm actually required by law to point this out. So an increase to or a decrease of the tax levy is not a change to your overall revenue because of the way the funding formula and the CUP works. So if your taxes increase, the state's going to kick in less. If your taxes decrease, the state's supposed to kick in more. And so because that funding formula is tied to property values, those changes are almost dollar for dollar. State aid's just going to make the difference up. We're just shifting between state share and local share of our total entitlement. The state would reduce our tax rate if we had grown by more than 2.5%. And again, even when you grow by more than 2.5%, that means even that compression, some homeowners will see much larger growth and others will see decline and some will stay flat. So it's really the district as a whole that this is calculating, not individuals. Overall, our property makeup stays very consistent. It might change by rounding one digit here or there, but 60% of our property makeup is in single-family homes, 23% is in commercial property, 10% in multifamily residential, and right now, the average home market value before protest adjustments decreased by $300 from $365,889 to $365,578. All right, so now we've talked about property values and property taxes, and they are the first things to fill the cup. Let's look at some of the key components of the funding formula. One of them is attendance, as we are funded on average daily attendance. So, some good news here. The bright green line, which is kind of in the middle, is the current school year. And that's why we only have through the 5th 6 weeks, as we are still finishing for a few more days, the 6th 6 weeks. And that bright green line is slightly higher than the blue line below it, which is last year. So we are seeing a slight improvement in our attendance rate. We're still not at the levels that we were back in 1920, and but it is good to see some progress here. And our trend is looking similar to our trends of the past. Another key component is enrollment. Each year we take a weighted 3-year average of survivorship, so how many students survive, stay with us from grade level to grade level by campus all the way through. It's a lot of numbers. And so the projection for 25-26 is just over 55,000 students. Oh, and I will make a note. We had projected 55,800 and change for 24-25, and our actual enrollment was higher. And so when we look at our forecast for the year, in a little bit, you'll see that our revenue is better because we ended up with more students than what we were projecting. All right, so let's take a look at some of our neighbors and their revenue. When we look at general fund revenue per ADA for last year, you can see that several other districts have a lot more revenue per ADA. A big driver of this is how many golden pennies they've gone out in their Tier 2 enrichment. It could be a couple of factors. Alamo Heights is sitting over there. They are in recapture, and so that recapture number is not reflected here at that. This is the way the Texas Education Agency requires us to report things. But as you can see, when it comes to revenue per ADA, compared to our neighbors, we're on the back end of it. Some districts receive other allotments, the small and mid-size allotment, which we do not qualify for, and that drives quite a bit of potential revenue for them. And as you can see, a lot of our neighboring districts have gone out and gotten other golden pennies. Some of them have gotten the coppers, so when you see it over 8, they've gotten all their golden and some of their coppers. And those of us with 5 are sitting at what is legally allowed without an election. Fund balance as a percent of expenditures. This has been pretty interesting over the years. Some districts just lived in a world where they had a massive amount of fund balance. Some districts have always been more of a kind of break-even kind of operation. The federal funding for ESSER changed a lot of things. And almost everyone's operating at a deficit these days, and so those reserves are starting to trickle down. We are kind of holding our own, and we'll talk more about fund balance in a little bit, but you can see where we rank. Some of these districts had socked away money for years, and it'll be a while before they get through their reserves. It is interesting to note, we're not seeing it this legislative session, but we often see it where legislators are focused in on how much fund balance districts have, and so sometimes they are not eager to provide funding when districts sit on a large amount of fund balance. All right. Okay. I think I need some water before we jump into this legislative session. All right. So let's take a look back at the 2023, the 88th legislature. This is where it ended. There was a lot of money for property tax relief. There was some money for the increase for school safety, and then a bunch of grants related to that. They had $5 billion that was planned for public education, but nothing ever passed. It got held up by the education savings account debate. There were 4 special sessions trying to get that through. That never happened. They did spend money on that they were required to on projected enrollment increases. They are required by law to increase the golden penny yield set at that 96th percentile wealthiest district. They increased some funding for new instructional facilities. They basically restored cuts that they had done for the new instructional facilities and the technology and instructional material allotments. And then they had to do some increases for TRS. Okay, so that was the last session. This session, we have, at this point in time, we have a few key dates left. May 24th is the last day for the House committees to report Senate bills. May 28th is the last day for the House to vote out Senate bills, and the last day for Senate to consider all bills. The last day of this session, called Sine Die, is June 2nd. So that's our next budget study session. So I'm very curious to see if things will change while I'm talking that night. I'm hoping we have more information than that. I hope it's not that last minute. And then June 22nd is the last day the governor can sign or veto a bill. And we will be adopting our budget before then. So there's a chance that something surprises us, and then in July we'll have to do a budget amendment based off of whatever happens, right? But that's not very likely. Let's talk about the bill process. To become a bill, first you've got to get out of the committee that in the chamber that created it, and then it has to make it out of the full chamber, and then it goes over to the other chambers, and it starts in the committee, and then they have to vote it out to the full chamber. So both sides have to pass it out of committee and chamber, and then they have to agree, and then it goes to the governor to be signed. So it's got a lot of challenges before it can make it. A bill has to get through a lot before it can be signed. So things have actually already been signed. There was a lot of press coverage when Senate Bill 2 was signed. It creates the educational savings accounts. Senate Bill 569 has also been signed, and that is just allowing public schools to continue virtual education under this framework that they have and made by the Texas Commission on Virtual Education. The one that we expect to see some impact from is Senate Bill 2, of course. It provides eligible families access to $10,000 in state funding to pay for private school tuition. Students with disabilities could access up to $30,000. Homeschool students could access up to 2,000, and there's some rules in here for when you switch back and forth. So if you stop using your education savings account and you roll in public schools, then they would generate another 0.1 weight in the funding formula and wouldn't be included in accountability that first year. Public schools, one thing that's in here is that public schools would be required to provide evaluations for special education upon request of any of those program participants. All right, so things that have passed both chambers but not yet made it to the governor. Senate Bill 1023 just requires adding hyperlinks to our truth and taxation forms. It wouldn't be any burden or anything. Senate Bill 1025 requires us to say this is a tax increase language on a proposition for voter approval with a tax rate election. House Bill 3526 creates a database on debt issued by school districts and other local governments, and then there would be a lot of reporting requirements associated with that, where we would have to send data and things, but nothing overly burdensome. House Bill 210 would prevent vendors from bidding on school district contracts. If anybody on the Board of Trustees had a substantial interest in that vendor or was related by the second degree of sanguinity to someone who had substantial interest, or if a board member had received a gift of more than $250. This actually puts it in code what kind of violation it would be, whether it's a misdemeanor and those kinds of things. But we are watching quite a few other bills. They are still alive at this point in time. At the regular board meeting, we talked about House Bill, or Mr. Bywaters talked about House Bill 19, which is one we were watching very closely. It never made it out of committee. So the deadline to get out of the House committee has come and gone, and so it is essentially dead. That's the one that would have restricted the majority of districts in the state from issuing new debt. It was set on a threshold that was pretty low and based off of your tax collections. And then every time the legislature does property tax relief, it would drive down your tax collections, and that percentage would be even lower, and it would generate a lot of issues for anyone doing bond programs and trying to issue voter-approved debt. Even though that bill has essentially died in committee, there are other bills out there that some of that language could show up, so we will continue to monitor those to see. One big bill that we would expect to finish eventually is Senate Bill 4, and that increases the homestead property tax exemption from $100,000 to $140,000. It does include hold harmless for us, so should not create a financial issue for the district. Senate Bill 1453 just changes some budget publishing and debt requirements in relation to that. Senate Bill 2529 would require 60% approval on the vote to issue bonds in order of VATRE. Senate Bill 2395 restricts uses of unspent bond proceeds to things authorized by the bond or to repay debt. Senate Bill 414 just changes some bond ballot language to include interest and principal. Senate Bill 506 says election ballot language must be neutral. I kind of thought it was already neutral, but this is just, I guess, maybe putting it in code that it's required to be. Senate Bill 533 would prevent May elections for bonds. And Senate Bill 1209 requires a minimum number of instructional days at 175. And Senate Bill 875 prohibits electioneering from school district staff. All right. But the one that we are watching most closely is Committee Substitute House Bill 2. This gets a lot of press coverage. It is the school funding bill. And the Senate had sent a version over to the House. The House had drastically changed it, sent it back. So now the Senate has changed what the House changed, and I think it's getting a hearing tomorrow.
It just passed committee. It just came out 20 minutes ago.
Like, while I've been talking, it has passed committee. So that means that it will go to the floor of the Senate, and then the House will have to either accept it or go to conference committee to hammer out the differences between their version and the Senate version. Okay, so let's talk about what this bill does. We have not had a lot of time with this bill. It is 225 pages. Late last week, we got
It's now 229.
Okay, it's 229 pages now. I can't wait to find out what those other 4 pages are. So we got a brief summary, and then we got a longer summary. We really haven't had this bill language very long, but a lot of it is pieces from other bills just kind of thrown together. All right, so let's talk about what this is. This very first thing is an increase in the basic allotment of $55. So it would go from $61.60 to $62.15. But this is not additional funding that they're providing. They're going to stop increasing the golden penny yield at that 96th percentile wealthiest district rate. So their intent is to freeze the golden penny yield and calculate how much they would have spent increasing the golden penny yield and then rolling that amount through basic allotment. Now, the good news is, by doing this, because we have one of the lower numbers of golden pennies, we actually get more when they roll it through basic allotment than had they left it in golden pennies, because now they're allocating the same dollars differently. The bad news is the version of the bill that was the last that I was able to see, they actually lowered the golden penny yield instead of freezing it. So it ended up costing a little bit more. Rumors are that they're going to fix that. So, but everything that I'm showing you tonight treats it as if they lowered that rate, as is the code that they wrote at the last that I saw. Okay, big news is it creates the teacher retention allotment. Don't let the word retention be confused with our retention supplements that we do. This is meant as retaining teachers in the profession. So this is meant to be a pay raise for classroom teachers. Now, the state requires defines classroom teachers very specifically. So there are some employees who are on the teacher pay scale who do not meet that definition of a classroom teacher, and so we would not be eligible to receive funding for those handful of teachers. But this is what the state's bill says, the Senate's bill says. If your enrollment district-wide is 5,000 students or less, 3 to 4 years experience would get a $5,000 raise. 5 or more years would get $10,000. If your enrollment's 5,001 or more, the 3 to 4 years experience would receive $2,500. 5 or more would get $5,500. So teachers with less than 3 years of experience would not be required for a raise. And the key for our perspective in the finance office here is that the way the language is written in the bill, the amount that they're giving us in revenue has to be passed on to the teachers. They are not providing any funding for us to pay the payroll taxes or the teacher retirement contribution that the district is required to. That's over 10%. So over 10% of this allotment, we would have to, they're not providing the funding for us to pay for that. So that would have to come out of our existing funds or other pieces of the revenue here. All right. So
Susie, and how much is that?
it's
Just-
about 1.8 million for us. So, moving on to the next piece is special education. And I missed the word education on the slide, I'm very sorry. So the new funding model for special education, this is something that the Special Education Commission studied, and Texas Education Agency has been a proponent of for a while. They want to change how those dollars are calculated by doing an intensity of service model. That is about as technical as I can get, as I'm an accountant and not a teacher, but that calculation, we have no idea what it's going to look like. And it wouldn't change until 26, 27. The law that's written right now in this code would tell the Commissioner of Education to create the formula. So there's not something for us to model to figure out how much we would get. They are adding additional dollars, so you would expect to see possibly some growth, but until you see what that formula looks like, there's no guarantee on what's going to happen there. Now, the good news is it wouldn't happen until 26, 27 because the agency needs time to write the formula, basically. So it wouldn't be ready for 25, 26 at all. They are also providing us with a $1,000 reimbursement for every special education evaluation we do. And so that actually generates an estimated $1.4 million for us. And given how much more we spend in special education than what we receive in funding, that's a good benefit to help us offset that spending that we've been doing. It also adds JROTC courses to the list of eligible career and tech courses. There is a cap, but that cap looks like, I think it's at 20 million, but that's about at what the estimates are statewide. We just don't know which courses and which tiers they would be in at this point in time. It increases the P-Tech multiplier. So students who are enrolled in a P-Tech program, the multiplier would go from $50 to $150. It provides additional funding and complexity for the early education allotment. Oh, so early education. Okay, let me take you back to 2019. House Bill 3 passes. And House Bill 3, the state requires full day pre-K at that point in time. But pre-K students only generate half day ADA. And so there was a disconnect between the requirement that we all provide full day pre-K and the funding formula. They didn't fix the funding formula, but what they did say is that the early education allotment part of the Tier 1 funding formula could be used to help pay the extra half-day costs for all the teachers and assistants for pre-K. The early education allotment is calculated using student average daily attendance in grades kindergarten through 3rd. And so those pre-K students aren't even included in the calculation of the allotment. So what they're trying to do here is make the early education allotment pay for pre-K. So they've added a layer that calculates based off of all of kindergarten through 3rd grade. Right now, the allotment only does economically disadvantaged students in K through 3 and students learning English in K through 3. And so now they're going to do another piece that is all students in K through 3. And then they're going to do an estimate of how much full day pre-K should cost your district and include that. Nobody's exactly positive how they're going to calculate that. We expect it to generate additional income, but not necessarily causes any real harm here. It's just not something that we can put our fingers on, and it feels very complex at this point in time. And now I'm just going to move on. So it also creates an allotment for required reading interventions. It increases the special education CCMR outcomes bonus. It goes from $2,000 to $4,000. It increases teacher incentive allotments and adds another level in 26-27. Then it increases the school safety allotment. That was a big push because House Bill 3 in the 88th legislature required an armed person at every campus, right? But the funding that they provided in that session didn't cover the cost for districts to do that. And so this helps offset that underfunding that they did in that last session. They increased the special education mileage reimbursement by 5 cents. And right now, we're only eligible to get reimbursed for the one industry-based certification exam per student. This would increase it to 2. And we've got a lot of students who do quite a bit. It changes the additional days school year. It expands it to grades 6 through 8. And if you do 200 full days of instruction, you can get a 50% increase in the funding. It allows children of classroom teachers to be eligible for state-funded pre-K. It does prohibit districts from charging tuition for non-eligible pre-K students. If an intermediary determines that a private provider has available capacity. So basically, TEA is going to name some intermediaries, and that's the term used in the bill, and they will determine whether or not a private provider is available. We don't know what the definition of available is. We don't know if it's within 20 miles or 2 miles, or we have no idea at this point in time. But there's a chance that we would be prohibited from charging tuition. So we allow non-eligible students to attend some of our pre-K, and we charge tuition for it since you don't receive funding for them. And so this could prohibit that. It reduces that Tier 2 golden penny yield, as we talked before, where they're trying to move it from to the basic allotment, and requires math achievement academies. It does waive some certification application fees to special ed and bilingual ed teachers. So some really good things in this bill. It provides grant funds to reimburse TRS surcharges for hiring retirees. Requires TEA to develop training for strategic compensation, staffing, and other topics. It allows a teacher to remove students from class, and then it has some requirements for the commissioner to adopt a list of instruments to use in K through 3 to measure literacy and math skills. And then we would be required to administer those twice in kinder and 3rd grade, and 3 times in 1st and 2nd grade. And then if 2 consecutive instruments are failed by a student, then they would require us to provide intervention, and they would provide some funds for that intervention. Require school boards to meet at least once a year to discuss the performance of special education students. This is a really big bill, and I summarized it in 4 pages, but there's a whole lot to it, and it grew by 4 pages since the last time I looked at it, so.
Ms. Lackhorn, I think Ms.
Oh.
Shelton had a question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Did you want to ask it, or you want to hold it for now? Well, I understand that. So we'll just hold it, we'll hold them for now.
Okay, we're almost at the end.
I feel like, because for my questions, we gotta go all the way back to the beginning, so I'd like to start with the one on 45 about pre-K. I just wanna understand that a little bit more. The pre-K one, you said that it prohibits the district from charging tuition for non-eligible pre-K students if there's a place that could do it.
Yeah.
So will we have to still take them if we
Michelle,
can't charge them?
can you turn on your microphone, please?
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Thanks.
So will we have to still take them if we can't charge, since they're non-eligible? We'll have the
We're-
option of not taking them?
Yeah, we're only required to take the eligible students.
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask a question while we're in the vicinity? So on slide 43,
I think my numbers are a little different than yours, but
it's
go ahead
the
and just,
committee substitute House Bill,
Mhm.
this one, yes. So on the creates new funding model for special allocation.
Education.
You said special education. Now, is that for, because above we're talking about pay raises for teachers. Is this funding model for pay raises or for pay raises in anything related to?
it's really, yeah, it's really for anything. And so basically, when we're back here, I'm gonna get there. Give me a second. Right here. So they calculate a funding formula based off a setting and say, this is how much we're giving you for special ed. And you've got to go fulfill your needs for special ed. And we spend twice what we're required to. And so they're going to change the way that's calculated. So the way that formula is working currently, they're going to change it. And so you spend that fulfilling the needs of your special education students, however that needs to happen. And so it's not specific to, you got to do this with it, or this with it, or this with it. This is for special ed.
Okay, so teacher raises and everything else included.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's all. Thank you.
Ms. Villarreal.
Okay, I'm in shock over here. And, I don't know whether to laugh or cry, all right, over this thing. Did I understand in all of this misery that's coming out of this, that let's say we have kids from charter schools or private schools or whatever, that we are required to spend money to test them?
Yes. So we would be required, if they request, to provide a special education evaluation for them. Now, and so that has passed through Senate Bill 2. The governor's already signed it. So we are required to provide that if they request. One thing I didn't put on here because there's so many points, but see where it says here, it provides $1,000 reimbursement for every special education evaluation? For 2 years, and 2 years only, they would give us $3,000 for every special education evaluation we did for the private schools.
But how much does it cost us to do this? Are we going in the hole? Because you know what's going to happen. The floodgates are going to open, and we're going to have everybody in San Antonio coming to have their kids tested here. So are we going in the hole over this even more severely than we already are?
So it would depend on how many requests we get. So we already have a lot of staff who perform these special education evaluations. And so it's just going to depend on how many requests we get to evaluate. At this point in time, I don't know. But I do know that after 2 years, we won't get anything, and we'd still be required to do those evaluations. So that reimbursement for us, for the private schools, would only be in 2 years. And that's if this bill passes. Right now, the only thing that's in law is that we're required to do it, and there's no funding attached to it at all. If this passes, we'd get reimbursed for 2 years, but it expires in this bill. And so in the third year, we wouldn't get reimbursed at all. And that's how I looked when I read it too.
I'm sorry, so the $1,000 reimbursement,
That's for our students.
that's for our students?
And that
Okay.
would continue. But the reimbursement for private school students will only last for 2 years.
All right,
Okay. All right.
keep moving.
Anything else about House Bill 2? All right, so how about some good news? We are better than what we thought we would be, okay? So when we were working on the budget and early in the year, we were projecting a bigger loss for the current year. But like I said earlier, we have more students than what we were projecting, so our revenue's higher. And one piece of the hold harmless property frozen values formula in the funding formula came in several million over my projection. And so that added revenue. And our expenditures actually didn't grow at the same rate with the increase in students. And so our projection for the current year is better than what we were projecting. So we're going to end the year in a better place than what we thought we would. It is still a deficit, but again, it's an improvement from where we thought we would end up. 25, 26, because we are implementing quite a few cost savings measures, that ends up better than what we thought it would. And so instead of ending up at 1 point something at the end of 26, 27, this is right here, current law. So some of this hasn't passed. This is current law. This isn't giving raises or increasing health insurance. This is everything status quo. 25, 26 has the things that we've already implemented, the consolidation of schools, those kinds of things, and it has our enrollment projection in it. So again, fund balance is going to last longer than what we were originally anticipating, and we're making progress. Now, so I'm just going to point out, at the end of 26, 27, things holding steady, us not making any changes in 26, 27, we'd end fund balance at 121 million or 2.7 months. When we walk through the committee substitute House Bill 2, this is what it looks like to us. Because so many of the funding pieces have spending attached to it, like the biggest piece of it's the teacher pay raise. We end up in a pretty similar position. 25, 26 looks better, but 26, 27, because that golden penny yield, we're no longer getting that, it ends up kind of leveling out in 26, 27, because the projected increase in the golden penny yield was quite sizable for 26, 27. So current law, ending fund balance of 121 million or 2.7 months in 26, 27. With committee substitute House Bill 2, as it was written, at 225 pages, 127 million and 2.8 months. So pretty similar outcomes with that bill, because so much of the funding is tied to spending. So what are our key takeaways? Main thing to remember is that increased property values do not increase our overall. Yes, ma'am.
Just have a question. It refreshed my memory, but don't we have to keep at least a 3-month? And if we so it's just 2.
Yeah, two is where TEA will start saying, "What's going on? How's it going? Do you remember us?" That's when they'll start knocking on your door.
Okay, so the 2.8 is still okay. So we're
Yeah, and remember, so 26, 27 here doesn't have us progressing in our efficiencies and making plans. That's us holding steady. And so we tend to project out holding all things steady. All right, so increasing property values does not increase our overall M&O revenue. Decreasing gets offset by the funding formula. Remember the cup. So when one side goes down, the other side goes up. So it just shifts between the state and the local share. Bear in mind, some of your neighbors will be like, "What do you mean your property values are flat?" Mine went up by 9%. So not everybody will see a flat or a decline. Some people are still going to see large increases. It just depends on where they're at and what the homes are going for in that area. And the main key takeaway we have at this point in time is like lots of unanswered questions with what the legislature is going to do. We don't know for certain. There were lots of rumors about this committee substitute for House Bill 2 about it was a done deal and it was going to be accepted, and then some people have made noise. We don't know what's going to happen with it, and so it's going to be something we're watching very closely. So apparently it's going to make it to the Senate floor soon, and then the House has to decide whether or not they're going to accept it or not. And if they don't, they go to conference committee. If they accept it, they'll send it to the governor. All right, so questions?
Ms. Landry.
Okay, just a couple of questions. And I know we're probably going to go more in depth over this, but for medical insurance
Yep.
rates.
We'll talk about that next in depth at meeting number 2.
Okay. And then for the bill, it looks like, am I misunderstanding this, that teachers are going to get a raise, and it's not going to be incumbent on us to go further in deficit to ensure that they get a raise? Is that?
So teachers who have 3 or more years' experience
Okay.
and are classroom teachers, so I clarify that because there are some people who are on the teacher pay scale who are not in the classroom for 4 hours a day, such as instructional coaches. And so TEA will go to our PEAMS reports and pull schedules to calculate that. And so you have to be a classroom teacher for more than 4 hours a day. You have to have 3 years or more experience. And then they'll give us funding for a mandated raise that they set the rates, but they're not giving us funding for the over 10% of the payroll taxes associated with it. And that's roughly 1.8 million that they're not gonna, that cost we will incur, but they won't give us the funding for.
Was
So-
that included in that last?
It's in my projection.
Okay.
Mhm.
So Miss Landry, so I'm gonna ask Susie some things. Does that, count librarians,
No,
counselors,
no,
nurses,
no,
bus drivers?
no,
Custodians?
No.
Cafeteria workers?
no,
Paraprofessionals?
no,
Auxiliary staff?
no.
It is not, it is taking care of certain teachers, and then it's excluding a lot of people within the system.
When was the last time legislation was passed to give any kind of raise?
2019.
2019. Okay. All right, that's all I had. Thank you.
Ms. Shelton,
You ready?
your floor is yours.
When we get paid, are we getting paid in arrears? Or are we getting paid on a projection?
Oh, that's a great question. So, that's, right now, the state estimates how much funding we'll be entitled to and gives us a few lump sum payments throughout the year. The bulk of our funding is, of course, property taxes, and the bulk of that comes in close to that January 31st deadline. So one of the reasons why having fund balance is important is that we start the school year but don't have the bulk of our revenue coming in until later in the year. This bill does something a little different, and it's one of the smaller points that I didn't even bother to mention, but it is talking about the TEA having to pay us more in line with what they're seeing our numbers come in at. So kind of real time instead of a projected number. So basically TEA has a projected ADA number for everybody, and they use that to fund them throughout the year. And then in August, after the year's over, they settle it up.
Okay.
This would require them to do that settle up a little bit more frequently during the year.
Okay.
Good or bad, it shouldn't make too much of a difference if you have enough fund balance to get you through.
Okay. To be dyslexic, how are you identified such that we would get funding to support you?
Yeah, so special education evaluates them and identifies them, and so they receive services for dyslexia, and that's how then they are flagged in our system and reported to TEA.
So if your parent has had you diagnosed, if you've been diagnosed privately and it hasn't been reported to the school, we're not getting funding to support
Yeah,
that?
Mr. Jarrett, do you want to speak to that?
So, all of our students, if we have signs or symptoms of dyslexia, we would test them, and then if they qualify, then they would automatically have in their PEAMS data that they are in dyslexia services.
But Mr. Jarrett, if they're tested from an outside, it doesn't necessarily mean we accept that, correct?
Correct, because we do our own testing just for verification purposes. I believe that is correct, right, Vanessa? Yes.
If you're tested internally, does that flag you for special education?
For dyslexia, you may fall under dyslexia as special education, but everyone is under special education now as dyslexia.
Okay.
That started 2 years ago, is that right? This year.
Okay. When is attendance taken for the state? Is it still second period? When I was in school, it's second period. Is it still second period?
I think there's some flexibility in when we do it. I think we're doing it
Yeah,
at
so
10.
it depends
Is it
on the
the-
level.
Yeah.
So it is second period for middle school and elementary, but when they get to high school, because you have to have seat time count in order to earn a high school credit, then it's taken every period. Okay?
Mm-hmm. How many, and it may not matter if, depending on what the change is, but how many golden and or copper pennies can we pull in before we are in recapture?
3 more golden pennies, and that's it.
So we can get to 8 and not be in recapture?
Yeah, as soon as you go beyond that, that additional funding would get recaptured by the state.
Okay,
Maybe not all of it, but majority of it.
okay. And then my last question is, it seems like every time I talk to you, I have this, I've never asked this question. We're capped. We can only get $1, right? We can't get $1.10 based on the number of students and the fact that some of it's coming from the state, some of it's coming from property, but at the end, it can only be $1.
Yep, the cup is the cup.
The cup is the cup. Okay, thank you.
That's the one thing, Ms. Shelton, I think is, people think we can, in a business, right, you could increase a fee or something. We don't have that ability. That cup is it. Like, they tell us what we're gonna get, that's what we get. The only way to generate revenue in it is like to increase your attendance, which is why we looked at we follow attendance so closely, and why we're encouraged by what we saw this year, which is a slight increase in it. We've deployed a lot of things this year to increase that. That's one of the way. The other way is to increase enrollment. That's why Susie said our forecast isn't as bad, because we projected and we got, 800 kids or about that many more. So those two mechanisms
600.
are the way to grab it.
Does the attendance, I know we're tracking attendance pretty closely and don't just wait till the end of the year, but does it look like it's trending this 6 weeks to be kind of on par with the other years where there's a slight decline? Or is it, do we have some other magic where it's going up for the rest of the year?
We should finish the year, because if you look here, that
Is it-
that bright green
Yeah,
and that blue line below it is the bright green's this year, the blue line is last year. So we should finish the year, unless we see a surprise tank in this last 6 weeks. It's very hard to pull 6 weeks attendance data in the
middle.
You have to
Yeah.
wait until everything
Okay.
gets cleaned up, because
Okay.
they're processing doctor's notes and
That's
all
true.
sorts of things. And so I have been burned in the past of pulling too early and getting my hopes up and then later on seeing it come
so
down.
theoretically, that green line should
Mhm.
generally parallel the blue line, let's say, because there's an expected dip
Mhm.
in that last 6 weeks.
That last 6 weeks, you always have that dip during flu season, which is that dip that you see consistently there in the 4-6 weeks.
Yeah.
That tends to be flu. And then you see another little dip at the end of the year, usually, as chaos happens for everything and everybody, right?
Going back to when we were talking about the tier 1 funds, kind of the first couple of slides, where you had if I read that correctly, there was a projected drop on the career technology.
That's just enrollment decreasing.
And that's what I'm saying, is it
Mhm.
just, even though we're making lots of efforts to increase our
I-
career technical participation,
I'm
it's
I'm
purely
hoping
just
to
a
be
numbers
pleasantly
game?
surprised,
Yeah.
but we still project an overall decrease in the allotments that are generated by number of
By
students.
number of students, okay.
Mhm.
And then I guess.
With a few exceptions.
Transportation would almost follow suit by cutting, and transportation is related to our bus routes and
Mhm.
those, I guess.
We tend to shrink that allotment year to year, because transportation actually creates efficiencies, and they're combining
Sure.
routes. And we talked earlier, you had a presentation just a few months ago about some of the changes we were talking about making. That won't have a huge impact here, but at the same time, just overall, we tend to have this happen. As the number of students shrink,
Right.
we need fewer routes.
Sure.
And so
Sure.
that's just a factor of it.
Okay. And we were talking about in House Bill, or I'm sorry, the bill that we were talking about, is that House Bill 2, where we're discussing the teacher allotment. And that is a true raise, meaning that it's not just a one-time money for them, so any future raise would be based on that increase. So if they get $2,500, that's now their base salary, correct?
Yes.
And so all of that money has to be used for those raises, and then we're carrying the burden of the 10% for payroll taxes.
Yep.
Okay. And then I guess one of the other questions I had was related to pre-K. Have we had the demand to expand pre-K? I assume we have the demand, but how has that looked in the past?
We do have the interest, but we don't have the kids in seats. And so there's always this risk and reward. So if we overestimate and we allocate staff and then kids don't show up, then we put ourselves in a bind. So we are watching that and kind of looking at trends and patterns to make sure they're consistent before we overcommit ourselves. But
Sure.
we have seen an increase in interest.
And then this is actually had a question somebody asked me that I thought I would pass along, but when a district gets into something like recapture, what prevents them from just adjusting their tax rate to where all of a sudden they're not in recapture anymore,
So
and they keep as much of the funds there as, I mean, obviously they're keeping the same amount either way, but I mean, is it
TEA always funds you on the different components based off of what you're supposed to collect in taxes. It is not based off of what you actually collect in taxes. So for a district to purposely lower their tax rate, TEA is still going to calculate what it should have been.
what it should have been?
Yeah.
So it's that should have
Yeah.
been is the key word. Okay.
It's a dangerous world.
Okay, that's all I had for now. Ms. Cox, you have some questions?
Oh, yeah, I just had one question about the TIA, the allotment. They're adding another category. What does that mean?
So right now there's 3 layers, and the higher tier you are, the more money. And so they're adding another layer, and so they're going to push everybody up and add a 4th layer, and it'll just mean that more teachers can qualify, and the teachers who get in the highest layer will get more money.
So you'll get more money, but it's not expanded out to different subject matters.
So the state allows you through your local plan to increase participation with their approval. And so as, like with Northeast, as we do this and get more experience with it, we may be able to bring in more groups, but TEA is going to have to approve that. They just set the levels, and then through our local plans, they approve whether or not your plan to evaluate that group of teachers is valid.
Thank you.
Did have a follow-up question on the attendance has there been any discussions, I know there were some early on in the legislative session about different funding models, I guess, and not necessarily ADA, but, based on enrollment instead of attendance, and it sounds like we're still on the attendance.
So last time I looked, Texas was one of 5 states still funding on attendance. The state of Texas seems very committed to incentivizing districts to make sure kids come to school. They're worried that one of the side effects of funding by enrollment would be discouraging kids from coming to school who create issues.
And
So
Susie, if I may, and Mr. Bywater's, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Chapter 37 bill, I don't remember what it is, whichever one it is, it addresses the attendance component in it, and it's actually bringing back, come on up here. It's actually bringing back, or trying to bring back attendance court, correct?
I believe that's HB 6, which is the Chapter 37 rework. The bill that's in this committee substitute is Senate Bill 27, which is the Teacher Bill of Rights. They both have a disciplinary aspect, but I don't believe HB 6 is in that committee substitute.
Right, so the attendance component, because when we were up there, we talked a lot about that with several different offices. Have they removed it now? that
In
component?
committees, I believe it's in HB 6, but not SB 27.
No. So that's one of the things that they've heard from, and we continued to, is, at this point, so years ago, if a kid wasn't showing up, you could take them to court and have kind of some legal action taken in to compel the parent to send the child to school. Then they removed it. They were discussing about putting it back. Sounds like there's getting some consternation around that.
Well, and to be clear, there is a separate bill. It's actually being heard tomorrow in K through 16 that deals a lot with truancy. So that is its own independent thing, SB 5. I'd have to check the exact bill number, but it still is an issue. But that I do not believe, as far as the last update that we've read, is not part of the committee substitute to HB 2.
And as far as moving to funding by enrollment, we saw one piece in one bill at this time. There was a lot of chatter in the last session
Right.
about it. We're not hearing the same amount of chatter this time. It would be very expensive for the state to move from funding by ADA to funding
By enrollment.
to enrollment.
Yeah, but Ms. Lackhorn, we've also discussed, and just so you all know, we have a little consternation around moving to something like that without a really good study being
Sure.
done in between sessions to see what would that look like. Because this system is so complex, you could fund it and actually fund it less through, it just
Yeah.
depending on how many of these allotments you start to adjust.
So knowing that the attendance component is obviously very important to the financial component of our district, I know over the last couple of years, well, really since whatever, 2021, we've really put a focus on attendance and putting extra effort on our teachers and administrators to reach out. Have we learned some lessons, or what is a lesson learned that we can say, we can't do that anymore, that's not gonna get the kid back in school, but, what's successful and what's not successful, trying to keep that number up.
Mr. Byer, I will tell you pretty universally, and I know you were at the last Student Voice meeting, but it's the relationships they have with those people in that building, period. I mean, I've talked now which is why Brandy and those folks put together, and then we asked them to personally reach out to students who aren't attending, because that relationship and that personal connection they have with their teacher, with a person at that campus, that's what they will come for. It's the single, it doesn't matter who I speak to, that's what I hear over and over and over again.
Any other questions, comments? Ms. Shelton?
Is there an opportunity to get the updated deck?
Yes.
Any others? Questions, comments? Ms. Thompson, good?
Thank you.
All right. Anything else, Ms. Lackhorn, or
Lots of
Mr.
data next
Villarreal?
time.
lot to digest?
No, but again, we expect some things to change this week. Mr. Bywaters will put together a summary for the week, and I will push it out to you all, sometime Friday, and we'll just kind of keep following things, because depending on which office you speak to is what they think's about to happen with HB2. Just depends.
Well, and with this information, I know we got this sort of in our normal time frame at the end of last week. This, and then as the next meeting come, we'll get packets of more information, and so we'll have our homework, and we'll go into more detail in the next budget session,
Yeah.
which I'm sure will be much longer than tonight.
Things are very fluid, because a bill that passes could impact compensation, obviously. And so that's going to, the bulk of that next meeting is all about compensation and health insurance. And so
Right.
a bill can really drastically change what we're talking about.
Because
that
if
day.
you look at the school safety line, that's still the old law. There's law out there brewing to increase that pretty significantly.
But it's got to get across the finish line.
Correct, it does. Right, Mr. Bywaters?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, this slide alone is just current law.
Good deal. All right, well, looking forward to graduation in the coming week. We'll have a little break and then come back to it in the next couple of weeks. So with that, item 7, adjournment, and the time is 7:10 PM.